So today, we're diving into the story and the strategic mind of a man who turned absolute soul-crushing devastation into his ultimate weapon. This is the Sun Bin framework.
Let's just start right there, with that single, chilling thought. I mean, this isn't just some clever line. It's the entire philosophy in a nutshell. It's about a man so completely broken on the outside that his only remaining battlefield was the mind of his opponent. And you better believe he would turn that battlefield into a tomb. This one realization, it's the key to understanding how profound weakness can be forged into an absolutely unstoppable strategic force.
Okay, so let's get into this first chapter. You know, every great philosophy, every big idea, it's usually born from a single defining moment. And for Sun Bin, that moment didn't come from a position of strength. Oh no, it came from the absolute depths of vulnerability. His entire worldview was forged in the fire of betrayal, and it was all built on the promise of a revenge that would be years in the making and absolutely perfect in its execution. I want you to just picture the scene for a second. A man who literally cannot stand, sitting in a chariot, deep in a dark forest. He knows a bigger, faster, stronger army is hunting him down, led by the very man who crippled him. But here's the thing, he isn't fleeing, he's not panicking. He is systematically, and with ice in his veins, setting a psychological trap. He's weaponizing the very idea of his own weakness, turning his enemy's arrogance into the bait. While his rivals saw this desperate retreat, Sun Bin was conducting a masterclass in psychological warfare.
And this right here, this brings us to the core concept. The Sun Bin framework isn't about overcoming your disadvantage, it's about using it. It's this radical idea that the thing that makes you look weak or underestimated or broken is actually your most powerful strategic asset. It's the belief that ultimate authority isn't found in a sword or a fancy title, but in the ability to control what your enemy thinks they see. And to really get how he mastered this, well, we have to understand how he was broken in the first place. To truly get this framework, we have to go back. We need to understand the trauma that created the strategist. See, this whole philosophy of the void, it wasn't some academic exercise he came up with. It was a survival mechanism, born from one of the most brutal betrayals in all of military history.
Okay, so now we're entering Sun Bin's darkest period. This is where he loses everything. His mobility, his reputation, his freedom. But what's so fascinating about this part of the story is how his feigned madness and total isolation became the very foundation for his unshakable mental strength.
So, before he was a legendary general, Sun Bin was a brilliant scholar. And his greatest rival, Pang Zhuan, was also supposedly his most trusted friend. But Pang Zhuan's envy was just all-consuming. He couldn't stand being in Sun Bin's shadow, so he orchestrated his downfall. He had Sun Bin arrested on bogus charges and subjected him to what's called the Bin penalty, a horrific punishment where they literally carved out his kneecaps, crippling him for life. And to complete the humiliation, they branded his face, marking him as a criminal, a slave. This wasn't just physical destruction, it was total social and psychological annihilation.
With his body broken, Sun Bin's only path to survival was to make Pang Zhuan believe his mind was broken too. So he pretended to be insane. For years, he lived in a pigsty, rolling around in filth, babbling nonsense, eating things no human being should ever eat. I mean, just think about the almost superhuman level of patience and discipline this required. Every single day was a performance, a test of his will to live, all while his enemy watched, totally convinced that the great mind of Sun Bin was gone forever.
And this comparison just illustrates the core of his transformation perfectly. On the outside, he was the picture of a broken man, mutilated, powerless, a raving lunatic. But on the inside, in the fortress of his own mind, he was working harder than ever before. He was calculating, planning, forging the strategic principles that would later redefine warfare. That pigsty wasn't a prison, it was his laboratory. He realized that if he could not stand on the battlefield, then he would make the battlefield exist entirely inside his enemy's mind.
So, how did he do it? How did he turn that experience into a strategy? Well, from that friction, that clash between physical erasure and intense mental focus, Sun Bin codified his experiences. He didn't just crawl out of that hell and survive. He built a powerful, repeatable, strategic philosophy. He turned his personal hell into a universal theory of power. So the first pillar of his philosophy is strategic deception. Sun Bin learned in the most brutal way possible that every time you show your strength, you're basically just handing your opponent a roadmap to your vulnerabilities. So he adopted a new rule. The more you hide, the more you see. He He completely rejected the idea that a leader has to be imposing or project power. True power, he realized, lies in being completely, totally unreadable. And that leads right into a second key concept: asymmetric vulnerability. This is the tactic of deliberately staying in the void, appearing weak, inactive, totally unimportant. You let your opponent make all the moves. You let them get confident, arrogant, careless. You wait for them to overextend their resources and expose their own weaknesses. Their ego becomes your greatest ally. It's like a chess master who sacrifices a pawn just to lure the other player's queen into a devastating trap. You're intentionally creating a weak spot to exploit a much, much larger one.
Okay, this brings us to the final, and maybe the most brilliant part of his philosophy: cognitive displacement. This isn't just about hiding. This is about actively manipulating your opponent's perception of reality. He stopped seeing the battlefield as a physical space. For him, it became a psychological one. He knew that if he could get his enemy to believe a lie, that he was weak, that they were winning, then their own strengths, like their speed and their arrogance, would become the very things that destroyed them.
Now, this all sounds great in theory, right? But Sun Bin was a pragmatist. He wasn't just some philosopher. He built a system. He turned these abstract ideas into concrete, actionable habits that he practiced with insane discipline, transforming his mindset into a literal machine for victory.
His most famous tactic is the perfect example of his system in action. It's often called the tactic of decreasing fires. When he was finally facing Peng Zhuan's army, Sun Bin didn't attack. He retreated. So on the first night, he had his army light 100,000 campfires, making it look like he had this massive force. Then the second night, only 50,000. On the third night, just 30,000. Now, for an arrogant guy like Peng Zhuan, this wasn't just data, it was proof of his own genius. He's thinking, "Ha, the cowards are deserting." Blinded by his ego, he abandons his slower, heavy infantry and just races ahead with a light cavalry force, straight into the trap Sun Bin had been preparing all along.
Another one of his core habits was what you could call environmental leveraging. Sun Bin saw the physical world as a strategic asset. He didn't just look at a map, he saw a weapon. He would systematically audit the environment, turning every hill, every river, every forest into an unwilling soldier in his army. To him, a narrow pass wasn't an obstacle. It was a force multiplier that could make a small group of archers as deadly as an entire army. And this is really what set him apart. While other generals were out there chasing glory and big, head-on battles, Sun Bin was obsessed with efficiency. A classic example is his besieging way tactic. So when an enemy army was attacking one of his allies, he didn't send his troops to fight them there. No, that's what they'd expect. Instead, he attacked the enemy's undefended capital city, forcing their army to abandon the siege and race home. It was foundational misdirection. He was always looking for the most efficient path to victory, and that path was almost never the obvious one.
And all of this, the pain, the patience, the philosophy, the system, it all converges at one single devastating point in time. We've arrived at the climax of the story, the final confrontation, the meticulously crafted trap at Maling Pass.
Let's just replay this from Peng Zhuan's perspective. For 3 days, he is absolutely high on the thrill of the chase. Every piece of evidence just confirms his own genius and Sun Bin's cowardice. First, 100,000 fires, a worthy opponent, then 50,000. Ha, they're running. He pushes his troops harder, then 30,000. The army has collapsed. He orders a forced march, leaving his supply lines and heavy support way behind. He finally arrives at this narrow pass called Maling late at night. His elite troops are totally exhausted, but his arrogance is at an all-time high. He thinks the crippled fool is just ahead, ripe for the taking.
And here, in the darkness, we see the sheer artistry of Sun Bin's trap. He had chosen Maling Pass specifically because it was so narrow. His men had found a huge tree, stripped its bark so it would stand out, and carved a message into the pale wood. Hiding in the darkness on the hillsides above were 10,000 of his best archers, and they had one simple order: do not make a sound until you see torches lit beneath that tree. So as Peng Zhuan and his men enter the pass, they see this strange, white tree. Curious, Peng Zhuan calls for a torch so he can read the inscription. The moment that torch flared to life, illuminating the words, "Peng Zhuan dies under this tree," it became the signal. 10,000 arrows rained down from the darkness. The trap was perfect. And Peng Zhuan, realizing he had been so utterly and completely outthought, took his own life right there on the spot.
And just like that, the trap was sprung. But the story doesn't end with Peng Zhuan's death. Sun Bin's victory wasn't just about revenge. It was the birth of a timeless framework for turning weakness into incredible power. So let's talk about how the lessons learned in that dark past can actually apply to our own lives. His legacy is that he completely shattered the myth that might makes right. He proved definitively that a superior mind will always, always defeat superior force. He showed the world that a feigned retreat can be more deadly than a charge, and that appearing weak is a structural advantage. Pure, egoless strategy is the ultimate force multiplier. He transformed himself from a broken criminal into the architect of victory, and in doing so, he left a blueprint for anyone out there who feels underestimated.
And that brings us to the crucial question for you. Think about a situation at work or in your life. Maybe a rival or a colleague constantly dismisses you, assuming you have nothing to offer. The normal response is to fight back, right? To prove them wrong, to be louder. But what if you did the opposite? What if you just went quiet? What if you let them think they're winning, while you focused on delivering a flawless project that speaks for itself? What if you let their assumption that you're a non-threat become the very trap that allows you to win in the end?
Because ultimately, that is the takeaway from the Sun Bin framework. You are more than your setbacks, you are a builder of traps. When you embrace strategic deception, you stop being a victim of circumstance and you start becoming the master of the void. The battle isn't always won with a loud charge. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is silence. Because the truth is in the mind, and your silence is the code for your greatness.